thank you all for being here today. I'm very happy, even though I had to brave the winter weather and the winter roads to be here with you all, but I'm very grateful to be here. So here's a brief look at what I'm hoping to chat with you all today. We'll talk about why these connections are important, situated in the context of ageism and social isolation, which are hopefully things that we are all somewhat familiar with. Talk about what the research says about why these connections are so important, and then talk about, kind of continue the conversation that you all started this morning around stereotypes and assumptions and how we can move past them. Then look at some difference and similarities that we may share and how we can navigate that. And then maybe I'll share some tips and tricks about communicating across generations. So to provide a little bit of context as to why I'm here standing in front of you all, and why I find, for me personally, intergenerational relationships are very important, I figured I'd tell a couple quick stories. So the first photo that you see on the left, that's me and my grandma. And when I was growing up, I was very fortunate that she lived a block away from me. So we spent a lot of time together, and we built a very, very close and very reciprocal, meaningful relationship. She taught me so much. Actually, in this photo, she's actually showing me the family recipe for halotsi, or cabbage rolls, which is part of my Ukrainian culture and heritage. So it was really special to be able to connect with my identity and with my grandma and my family history through her sharing that family recipe. And when I moved away from home and went to university, I came to miss my grandma quite a bit. And I realized that, hey, I don't have to be related to somebody older than me to spend time together. And so I started to seek out these kinds of connections in the community. And then I realized, hey, not a lot of people necessarily might do this, and it might be great for us to provide some more opportunities for this. And so I started a program called When I Grow Young that connects kindergarten to grade 2 students with older adults that are living in residential care in Vancouver to connect and to build friendships. And so this middle photo is very special to me. This is James. He's 105 years old, and this is the day that we celebrated his 105th birthday together. And the little kid that's shaking his hand, his name is Max, and Max is 5. So there's 100 years difference between these two, and they lived in a very different world. They grew up in a very different world. 100 years is a long time. But you know what I found really special about this is they were actually able to find a commonality. They both love baseball. And so when I would be sitting with them, they would be chatting excitedly about baseball, and James would share about what it was like for him growing up to play baseball, and they're talking about their favorite players, and it was just really cool to see that even though there's 100 years difference, that there's still things that we have in common. Now that I'm here in Calgary, I am very, very grateful to be partnering with Linkages, and they run intergenerational programs across the city to do my thesis research. And I've been able to speak with a number of older adults and youth that are taking part in these programs and have developed some really cool intergenerational connections and relationships. And so I'll be sharing some of what they have shared with me today in hopes that it inspires all of you. So why are building intergenerational connections important? Well, ageism is probably one of the most widespread and the most socially accepted form of social prejudice. And ageism includes the stereotypes, so how we think, prejudices, how we feel, and discrimination, how we act towards ourselves and each other based on age. And I'm curious, and I'm wondering if folks would be willing to raise their hands if you have ever been treated differently because of your age. I'm gonna put my hand up too. Okay, look around the room and see whose hands are up. Is it just one generation whose hands are up? No. So thank you. Ageism goes both ways. I think oftentimes when we think about ageism, we think about how it's directed towards older adults, and it certainly is. Ageism has us believing that age is a burden, and getting old is a period of decline. And this diminishes the status and the importance that older adults have. And I know even for myself, I never really connected the dots between ageism and experiences of young adults and youth as well. But this often manifests in terms of paternalism that's directed towards younger people. And this idea that younger folks are unable to make decisions for themselves, that they're irresponsible and rebellious and up to no good, and really leaves young adults quite powerless and voiceless in decision-making spaces. And that's a similar experience to older adults. How many times are decisions made for or about young or older adults, and young and old adults are not in the room? And this is important to me because these negative perceptions and stereotypes that are rooted in ageism really limit our abilities to connect with each other, because they have us believing that we are so different from each other and that we don't have anything in common. So ageism has really eroded that solidarity that's across generations. And I don't like this because this limits our opportunities to build connections with each other, to learn from each other, and to build community and to address the inequities that we're facing in this world together. So now another one of my favorite words, social isolation. So once again, I would love if folks could raise their hand if in the last little while or last few years, have you ever felt isolated or lonely? I'm gonna put my hand up because the pandemic's been pretty hard. Once again, look around. It's not just one generation putting up their hand. So I think because of the pandemic, social isolation has become a word that we are all unfortunately familiar with. And before the pandemic, this is a word that is very well studied in gerontology about older adults and their experiences of isolation and loneliness. But what the research has found is that young adults are actually facing this same issue too, which I don't know if I really need to tell you because you're living it. But one of the things that I found interesting was that the Calgary Foundation actually put a report out in 2020, and they surveyed folks across the city, and they found that 30% of Calgarian young adults reported that they often or always feel lonely, and this was a percentage that was much higher than any other generation. So it's looking quite high for older adults, and it's looking quite high for young adults. So perhaps this is an experience that we share in common. And I think that at a time when there's these generational divisions and people are feeling isolated and alone, and I think this is why it's important for us to build community and increase solidarity across generations. So what does the research say? So the research has actually highlighted some of the beneficial impacts of creating and maintaining relationships with people who are outside of our own generation. The research has found that intergenerational relationships and friendships have many health and social benefits for young adults, for older adults, and for the community at large. So some of these things are a decrease in social isolation and ageism, an increased sense of belonging, self-esteem, and purpose, increased quality of life, enhanced opportunities for the sharing of ideas, knowledge, and experience, new friendships and social networks, and increased community engagement and cohesion, and volunteerism. And it provides us with opportunities to come together to tackle critical issues in our community. So how do we build these connections? The research has also highlighted some of the key aspects that help to foster strong intergenerational connections. So this includes training that attends to negative stereotypes and frames the other group in terms of positive and beneficial qualities and addresses fears. And this is important because this allows us to recognize and reflect on the stereotypes and assumptions that we might hold, and allows us to move past those to build those meaningful connections. Another key piece that's been highlighted in the literature is around having purposeful and meaningful activities. And I'm sure this kind of makes sense. It's kind of awkward sometimes when you're just sitting down at a table with people that you don't know and you're like, how do I strike up a conversation? So sometimes having an activity or working on something together and having a common shared goal can kind of help make that conversation start to flow, because it's not always easy. Some of us are definitely more chatty and can strike up a conversation with nothing. And sometimes it takes, something, even if it's something as simple as like doing a puzzle or working on what we're doing today, all these activities, and having like a facilitated discussion can be really helpful in the beginning. Another key thing that was highlighted in the literature that we'll talk about a little bit more too is to look for mutual interests, experiences, and characteristics, because this can help us to overcome differences. However, even though we may have differences, these things get us talking, and we can actually learn a lot from those differences if we're open to it. And so really focusing on sharing knowledge and skills and experiences that we have across generations can really promote a greater understanding and has a ripple effect on our lives. And the final point that is very close to my heart is to make sure that it is reciprocal or mutually beneficial for both generations. So I think oftentimes we think about how one generation has something to offer to the other, and we neglect to really see and consider how we actually are both coming into these relationships with different perspectives, different worldviews, different opinions, different experiences. And we both have something to offer in that relationship and in those conversations, and we can all take away something as well. So really making sure that it's not one-sided, right? If it's one-sided, it might not be as beneficial as we would like it to be. So I know we kind of started this conversation already around stereotypes. Because ageism is so prevalent in our society, we do often hold stereotypes and assumptions about what it means to be a young or an older adult. And so I put some of these on the slide. Some of these are the ones that I've heard, either said to me. I'll be honest, sometimes I've even thought these things. You know, we're not all immune. Even myself, as somebody who does a lot of work in this area, I have work to do too about these stereotypes and assumptions and unpacking that for myself. And I think it's important to really reflect on these because these stereotypes can really lead us to believe that we are vastly different from each other and that there's no point in trying. But I would argue that there certainly is, and I don't know. I feel like a lot of these things are not necessarily true. And to prove my point, if you don't believe me, believe some of the lovely folks that I've had the privilege of chatting with about this in my thesis research. So here's what some of the youth and the older adults who participated in my thesis had to say about these stereotypes and assumptions and how their intergenerational relationships had perhaps shifted their perspectives. So Brenda, who's an older adult in the programs, she shared with me that the youth changed my vision of a version of a teenager today because they were so open. They can put their phones down for a couple hours each week and we're all willing to share. Jacqueline is a youth, and she shared with me there are actually young people who couldn't wait to learn more from older adults and make the world a better place. So kind of countering that idea that young folks are just focused on their peers and are not interested. In fact, Jacqueline was very, very interested in the stories that older adults had to share with her, and those were ones that she shared with me and really influenced the direction that she took in her life. Esene is another youth, and she was telling me all about this wonderful older adult that she had the privilege of connecting with over the past school year. And she had said that at first she was kind of nervous and she didn't know what to expect or what the heck they would talk about. And she shared this with me. She said, he had so many jokes and he was so positive and motivational. Older people are nice. Not all of them are just going to yell at you if you try to talk to them. And Ope, who's another wonderful youth that I had the privilege of speaking with, she shared with me this, and this is something that she actually talked about with her older adult friend. She said, not all young people are rude or entitled. It has more to do with your experiences, your background, your personality than age. It's not an age thing. Society makes it up that it is an age thing, but it's not. And I really hold Ope's words really close to me, and I tend to, I kind of thought about it a little bit after she shared this with me. We often think that it's an age thing, and I think societal discourses around age and what it means to be older or younger really inform those stereotypes and assumptions. But perhaps it actually has more to do with personality, right? Or individual circumstances than it has to do with age. So another thing to keep in mind about intergenerational relationships is that we may have different experiences and perspectives and circumstances. And there definitely is generational differences, and the context that we did grow up in really does shape our perspectives and our ideas and even the language that we use. And a few of the folks in my thesis research have shared about how the differences between young and old do not mean that these meaningful relationships can't develop. And so I'm going to read a couple. I'm going to move over here so I can chat with the folks over on this side of the room. So Jacqueline shared with me that she was talking about how she noticed that there was some similarities and some differences in some of the things that she learned. And she said that, I just learned about the fashion trends that have changed and different language that we use. We say words now and people are like, what does that even mean? And sometimes older adults will say words and we'll be like, what? And then different worldviews. But it's surprising how much stuff you actually do have in common. Although a lot of stuff changes over the years, there's a lot that's still the same. And even if you aren't the same, then you're still seeing another perspective. And I think Jacqueline really brings up a good point about language. And I think I saw on the table that I was sitting at briefly that there was a sticky note about language, which was cool to see. We have different slang words, we have different sayings, and I think sometimes it can be hard because language does shift over time. And sometimes folks will say something that may have been socially acceptable, like 30 years ago, but things have shifted. And I think, there is a difference between impact and intention. Oftentimes the intention is actually not to be offensive. And so I think it's really important to talk about that and open up a conversation about it in a way that is showing kindness and grace and understanding and humility for both sides. Brenda, who's an older adult, she shared with me how she felt like she kind of got out of her own bubble a little bit with this program because she was so used to being around folks that were her own age, that were from her own cultural background. And she shared that we're such a diverse city and everybody's got different way of doing things, and that's okay. I learned about different cultures and religions and about what it's like to be a teenager nowadays. And I think the really cool thing that Brenda shared with me that was very touching was that actually being able to learn about these differences and being willing to open up and share about different perspectives allowed her to actually think a little bit more about her own perspectives and actually allowed her to shift some of the things that she believed to be true or felt really strongly about. And after these conversations and the learning that happened, that kind of shifted for her, which I thought was really, really cool. Ope also shared, she was talking to me about how they were talking and sharing about the different music in the generations and were playing their favorite songs across. And she said she was actually quite surprised at how much she actually really liked some of the older adults' music choices. She said, "Don't ever tell anybody that, so I'm sorry, Ope." Jokingly, of course. But she said, "We learned things about different generations, like our different music tastes. It's a lot far apart, but it's really nice because what I got to kind of realize is that each era does not really end. Eras keep coming back again and again, just how fashion is right now," which I tend to agree because I was just looking at photos of my grandmother when she was around my age, and I dress very similarly to how she dressed. And Ope also shared something else with me that I wanted to share with you when I was looking through everything that was part of my research. She said, "Having people from different generations, different backgrounds, different experiences coming together and just trying to learn something from each other without discrimination against each other. It's okay if we do not agree on some things together." And I think that's really a point that I want to drive home, is that it's okay if we're different. We can learn more about each other, about ourselves, about the world, when we're willing and open to discussing these differences. So it's not something that we should necessarily shy away from or say, just because this person is a different age than me means that we have nothing to talk about. In fact, you probably have an awful lot to talk about and an awful lot to share. And so despite these differences, we may also have more things in common that we actually might realize. So we might have shared experiences, shared interests. I've seen, baseball. I've seen knitting, even just shared cultural identities and family histories and how meaningful it can be to talk about that as well. A shared desire for learning and growth, which I imagine most folks in the room can relate to, that you're all here today because you have a desire for learning and connection and growth. And I think also too is we also have shared experiences of social isolation and ageism. And those are important social issues that I think we need to tackle, and perhaps coming together across difference and connecting, we can find a creative, meaningful way to challenge that. So another thing that we might actually have in common is that it can be very nerve-wracking to meet and speak to new people. And so I wanted to share with you some of the things that the folks in my thesis research have shared with me about what it's like to communicate across generations, in hopes that that might get you thinking. So I'm going to start with Virginia, who is a lovely older adult who is living in residential care and has been a part of the linkages programs for more years than she can remember. And she said that the youth are super friendly. Whenever I share a story, they find it really interesting and ask more about it. At the end of the day, regardless of age, we're all just people. And Jacqueline, once again, she shared with me about her conversations and connections. And she just mentioned how they would just hang out and they would share stories from the week and just talk about whatever, and how it was really nice to have that space to just come and just talk, and for it to be a space where there was no judgment, I remember she had mentioned to me, when I started, I was really nervous that the older adults were going to find me boring and that I had nothing to say. And in fact, they found what I had to share really interesting. So yeah, I think that goes for both sides. We all have something interesting to say. And Ope really focused on like the importance of trust and also kind of mentioned that idea of not judging either. And so she said, trusting one another and being open with one another. Because at the end of the day, it's their story and you don't really have a place to judge or anything. And Brenda, she also shared with me about how amazing it was where they started out as strangers, kind of like you are all today, sitting at a table across from people that you don't necessarily know. But she said that after a couple of sessions, everyone was best friends. And she said it was just because of their ability to converse with one another and to ask questions and to be patient and to not judge. And she just really highlighted that it's important to just show up and be yourself. So, based on what all of these lovely folks have shared with me about their experiences and on the research and my own personal experiences, I want to leave you all with maybe a few communication tips. The first one that I think is really important is to really keep an open mind and to be aware of those potential biases or assumptions or stereotypes that you might hold. Awareness is the first step, right? And I think sometimes we might not even understand or be aware of the biases that we might hold if we're not exposed to something different. The other piece that I think is really important is that we don't necessarily need to change the way that we speak. I think oftentimes when we're speaking with folks from another generation, we might change the way that we speak. And so I will admit I've even done this myself. It's something called elder speak. And so when somebody who's younger is speaking to somebody who's older, we have a tendency to really talk very slow and very high-pitched and, hello, how are you? We don't need to do that. It's not just, imagine what it would be like to have someone speak to you like that. We don't need to change that. And I think the same thing goes on the other side. Oftentimes when we're speaking with somebody who's younger than us, we have a tendency to talk down. Also, once again, I think really going back to this idea that we all have something meaningful and interesting to share. You don't necessarily need to change the way that we speak. Just be yourself and speak the way that you speak. There might be language trip-ups, like I said, words change. But I think that at the end of the day, if we have humility and recognize that it's okay to make mistakes and to acknowledge and learn from them, it's going to be okay. There was another quote from one of the youth that I thought was interesting that I do want to share. She said, people our age, talking about young folks, talk really fast and a lot and higher pitched. That's what I've noticed talking to older adults. So sometimes I do take it down about 5 notches and try to be a little bit slower and not talk a mile a minute. Because you actually understand people more when you're slower and you don't jump to a conclusion because you actually don't know what they might say. Because Jacqueline was talking about how when she's talking to people in her own generation, there's a tendency to talk over each other and interrupt and interject. And she said, slowing it down and really being present and listening to hear and not to respond and being curious about people's experiences was really actually quite helpful rather than, continuing to talk a mile a minute, which I know I'm also very guilty of. That leads into that point that I have here on the slide of be curious and listen to hear and not to respond. And remembering that we can really learn through differences, right? We may have things in common and we can look for commonalities and shared interests and experiences. And those are really awesome and we can even learn about that. But it's okay if we're different too. And we can some really great conversations have happened when we talk about what's different. I know even some of the folks have shared about how high school and university classes look a little bit different than they did maybe 50 years ago. And how that was a really cool starting point to kind of open up a conversation and learn hey, what was it like to attend Mount Royal years ago? I wonder that. I wonder because I'm a student at U of C and I always wonder what would it have been like to have to not go on the library, if you need to find an article for a paper, instead of being on the computer and just looking it up from the comfort of home in your sweatpants, to have to actually go through the stacks. I'm very curious about that. So if anybody has that story, please come find me. And I think the last point that I will leave you all with is that everyone, regardless of age, has really unique opinions and perspectives and stories and knowledge to share. And we will miss out on that unless we're willing to be open and to start those conversations with each other. So I hope that you all will have a chance to do that today. And I will say thank you.